All sorts of predictions of when Jesus would return have been made and are still being made today. What so many of us don't realize is that the Bible is very emphatic and clear about when the coming of Christ would happen. But many of us fail to look at this or simply don't see it when we read the scriptures because of our filters. Let's take a look again about what the scriptures say about when Jesus would return. Revelation 1:1 and 22:6 says, the second coming would be soon. Revelation 2:16, 3:11, 11:14, 22:7, 22:12, and 22:20 says the day would come quickly or shortly from when Revelation was written. Romans 13:11 through 12, Philippians 4:5, Hebrews 10:25, James 5:8, 1 Peter 4:7, and Revelation 1:3 and 22:10. They all say the time was near from when those books were written. And Acts 17:31, 24:15 and 25, 26:22, Romans 8:18, Ephesians 1:21, 2 Timothy 4:1, 1 Peter 5:1, Revelation 1:19 and 17:8 says the events were about to take place from when those letters were written. Look at what Hebrews 10:37 says. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. Now, no disrespect to anyone, but saying 1,000 years is like a day and a day like 1,000 years to ignore or dismiss all these time statements as meaningless is a major cop-out with dealing with these scriptures. 1,000 years is like a day is a quote from Psalms 90 verses 2 through 4, which is only speaking of God being ageless and eternal. It is not speaking about his sense of time or how God measures time. And if the apostles believe that God measured time differently and no one knew when those things would happen, why would they repeatedly say the coming of Jesus and all the events of the last days was soon, near, quickly, shortly, and about to take place? Also, throughout the scripture, God never communicated time statements in a confusing way to people. He always communicated when things would happen according to how those people he was talking to measured or understood time. Do you really think God suddenly just changed his ways in the New Testament? We also have many other statements in the Bible of when Jesus would return that we can't explain away with 1,000 years is like a day. 1 Corinthians 15:51 says about the resurrection at Christ's coming, behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep or die, but we will all be changed. Now, keep in mind, Paul is speaking to the Christians living back then, not to us today. The we who would not all sleep were the Christians living back then who would not die before the resurrection happened. 1 Thessalonians 4:15 says about the second coming of Christ, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep. Again, Paul is speaking not to us, but to the Christians back then, and is saying some of those people alive back then would remain until the second coming. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 16:28. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So those standing in front of Jesus back then would not taste death or die until Jesus returned. This cannot be 2,000 years later. It had to be in the lifetime of Jesus' contemporaries. Now, this verse could be stretched or twisted to mean something other than the final coming of Jesus, unless we look at the context of verse 27, which says, for the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. So according to Jesus, the Son of Man coming in his kingdom is when the Son of Man would come in the glory of his Father with his angels. Matthew 25:31 shows us that the Son of Man coming in the glory of his Father with his angels is the final coming of Jesus. Jesus said in Matthew 16:28, some of those standing in front of him back then would not taste death until this happened. Also, the Son of Man coming in his kingdom is when Jesus would repay every man according to his deeds. Romans 2:6 and Revelation 20 verse 12 show us the repaying according to men's deeds is the final judgment which precedes the final return of Jesus. Jesus said in Matthew 16:28, some of those standing in front of him back then would not die until this happened. In Daniel 12:13, Matthew 13:39, Luke 20 verses 34 to 35, it shows us the resurrection at the coming of Christ would be at the end of the age. Funny thing, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:11 that the Christians alive back then were living at the end of the age. And in Matthew 24:34, Jesus said the end of the age, which is mentioned in Matthew 24:3, would happen back in that generation. The age would end, and therefore the resurrection at the coming of Christ would occur in that generation back then. Now, if you find yourself trying to think of all these different ways to explain all these scriptures and find a different explanation for them, would you stop for just a second and just think with me? Is it possible that we've been wrong? Is it possible for Christians to sometimes misinterpret what's in the scriptures? Now, I know you might be wondering, how is it possible that Jesus returned? What about this? What about this? What about this? And how did this happen? How did this happen? Now, all of those things are important. But what the scriptures say about when those things would happen is just as important as what the scriptures say would happen. Neither one of those aspects should be ignored or dismissed or read over. The time statements of when the return and all the last days events would happen are far too overabundant and far too clear and explicit for us to dismiss them or try to explain them away. So this leaves us with only two options. We can consider that our interpretation of the scriptures concerning the nature of Jesus' coming and other events has been wrong, and go back and restudy these and look to see if there's a different explanation. Or we can say that all the apostles and Jesus himself were dead wrong. Which one of those two options are you more comfortable with? I'm Micah Stevens. God bless, and thanks for watching.